I'm going to tag this on the front of this video because inevitably, anytime I mention grand solar minimum, I get comments telling me to put my mask back on because there's no such thing as a grand solar minimum. It's a real simple fact, guys. Civilizations rise and fall with these cycles. And no, they did not have cloud seeding technology 200, 400, and 600 years ago. Now, yes, they have had this technology. I have done videos on this. They've been using it since the 1950s. They used geoengineering as a weapon during Operation Popeye in the Vietnam War. They do have the technology, but the Earth is a very, very big place. I would say that if they want to flood a localized area, yes, they can definitely do that. They can probably do a very large area. But I do not think that they are spraying the entirety of the Pacific Ocean. I don't think they have the technology to be changing the jet streams. Now, even if they do have that technology, that doesn't change the fact that when you read the historical records of things, they may not have known what the jet stream was, but just by reading the effects of what happened, you can tell that the jet streams changed. And like I said all along, if I had this technology and I knew natural cycles were coming with climatic shifts, then I'd just save it for that time. I want to say thanks to Dave Trev for his comment and the link that he left for grades 3rd through 8th and how to build a sunspot viewer. When I was in school, we had a solar eclipse and we built these to view the solar eclipse with. Evidently, you can build the same box to view the sunspots with. Sunspots are a very real thing. Any amateur astronomer and anybody with a cardboard box, a piece of tinfoil, and a piece of paper can build a viewer to view sunspots for themselves. These are verifiable happenings that do occur. But for those who want to close their eyes and plug their ears to verifiable science, I'll put a chronology down in the comments, and you can skip over the weather history and the grand solar minimum history, which has been the driving force behind the mud floods and behind all of the climatic and cataclysmic earth changes that we've experienced. Enjoy the vid. What's up, guys? Static in the Attic. I figure it's about time to get back into another round of history videos. If you guys haven't noticed, I go hard for a little while and then I have to take a break. I've always been a sprinter and not a marathon runner. And hey, when there's current affairs going on that seem really important, I do think it takes precedence over history, because history is always going to be the same. The future is up for grabs. Now, I am going to label this a mud flood video, but I am going to do a full disclosure. My idea is and always has been a much more practical idea of mud flood theory than most of the other channels out there, in my opinion. I figured there's a logical explanation for everything. That's the way I look at things. So far, I have proven 3 different methods of what I would call a mud flood. There are lahars, which is a volcanic, basically mudslide. You have seismic activity around a volcano. So, I've had people ask me, what is a mud flood? And I say, well, it depends on where they are. It's hard to just pick it's not one flat out answer for everything. It depends on the location. If it's near a volcano, I have proof of 20 to 30 meters of mud taking out villages. If it's near a river, well, then it's just a regular flood that brings in a lot of silt and mud. And then there's also liquefaction that I have put out a video on. I showed the Alaska earthquake back in the 60s. Guys, underground is nothing but aquifers. I mean, it seems like all of the water underground around the world is all connected. So when you have a major earthquake, the water seeps up to the top, and heavy structures that are on top will sink down. So like I said, my idea of mud flood is a very practical idea. It's nothing out of this world, nothing that can't be explained. It's not like one event happened one time, and then that was it. And then it's been covered up by history. Now, these events have been covered up by history. You don't learn about this stuff in the classroom, but again, I think there's a logical explanation for everything. I still think some of the more extreme things could have possibly happened, like California being an island, not just because the maps show it, but because I found written accounts of sailors that got caught in the current and were forced to sail down through the Strait of California, as I call it. And then there's the old Lake Conibus that shows up on all of the maps. And I think 100% that it was there now, because I found the geological surveyors have confirmed that there was an ancient lake there. But they date it back, millions and millions of years ago. It was back in the Paleolithic era. So definite discrepancies. And as you will see in this video, with the Mississippian culture and Cahokia, you ask three different historians, anthropologists, whoever, and you'll get three different answers on what happened to them. So it just goes to show that academia talks a big game. They'll throw it out there like they know what they're talking about, but they don't all agree. And when you have one saying drought and one saying flood, that just goes to show that they don't know. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Mississippian culture that lived in this area, the destruction of Cahokia. We'll do some comparative histories because we don't have written accounts from the Americas of the time frame of the 14th century when this destruction occurred. We've got some map anomalies, and then we've got some eyewitness accounts from 1671 of some of the first explorers coming over and exploring the East Coast. And I mean, when you read it, it sounds like it was a paradise here. And we'll talk about what really happened. What caused the demise of the Mississippian culture, and why did they fall into separate tribes? So let's just start right there. What was the driving force between these dramatic and oftentimes cataclysmic earth changes? Well, if you're new to this channel, you might want to start looking into grand solar minimums. Now, physicists out there are trying to write all these formulas, trying to explain the cycles of the sun and everything. I still think it is due to exterior forces. I think comets and asteroids and stuff like that in the electric universe model are coming in and throwing off the balance of the sun, basically. I'm not going to go too deep into that. But these periods are characterized by an uptick in volcanic activity, especially instances like the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption that caused a volcanic winter. Before I started this channel, I thought that was ancient history kind of stuff. But no, just 200 years ago, Mount Tambora went off, causing a year without summer. Many people froze and starved to death. And guys, I told you from the beginning, I'm here to tell the truth on this, because I just don't agree with, BSing around about this, because we are going into a grand solar minimum right now. We've got over 100 days without sunspots this year. And historically speaking, these are very rough times with enormous changes. So you have shortened growing seasons. You have crops that used to grow at a north or south latitude that you can no longer grow there because of the shortened harvest season. And historically, these have caused either great famine or great migration from northern latitudes. So you have the volcanic activity, you have an uptick in earthquakes, and you have extreme flooding, extreme drought, rapid weather shifts, and that will all be evidenced when we get to the comparative history part of this video. Now, I've said many times on here that I don't agree with carbon dating because they are going under the assumption that there was the exact same amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere all throughout history, and I think that is a huge presumption on their part. But dating methods that I do agree with is ice core samples, and I'm starting to like the pollen samples. So when the scientists drilling down in Antarctica's dates line up with anthropologists' dates, then I'd say they're pretty well spot on. But that's not always the case, and you will see that when I compare Europe to Peru. So let's do a quick history of these climatic shifts in our history, starting with the medieval warm period from approximately 950 to 1250. And they say that possible causes of the medieval warm period include increased solar activity, so more sunspots, which right now the sun is creating less sunspots and we're going into the eddy minimum. Decreased volcanic activity, of course. If there's no sulfates in the air blocking the sun, then yeah, it's going to warm up. And changes to ocean circulation. Now, the deep ocean currents are basically the conveyor belt that keeps all of our temperatures steady. That's why in Southern California, all along the West Coast, you have a nice steady, it doesn't drop down to 30 degrees there because of the air traveling across the ocean for so long. So deep ocean currents are very important to stable atmospheric conditions. When these start changing, then you have major changes. Following the medieval warm period, then you had the Wolf minimum, a period of low solar activity that lasted from 1280 to 1340, official dating. It was accompanied by a fall in global temperatures that marked the start of the transition from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age. Now, it didn't just happen all at once. This happened in phases. So that was from 1280 to 340. And then you had the Sporer minimum, which was a 90-year low solar activity cycle from about 1460 to 1550. See, there's really no rhyme or reason. There's no clear-cut cycle to this because right here you have about a 100-year gap between the minimums. But guys, this was a 90-year span of lowered solar activity. And then, of course, you had the Maunder minimum in the 1600s, the Dalton minimum in the 1800s. But in this video, we're going to be focusing on the Wolf minimum, the period of the 1300s. The Mississippian culture seems to have stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Canada, and they say the time frame that they lived there was from 800 AD up until about 1600 AD, and that's when they started falling into the different tribes that we're familiar with from when Westerners first came over. The Iroquois, Shawnee, Delaware, Micmacs all up in the Northeast, and then the Powhatans, Cherokees, Creek, Natchez, Choctaws, Chickasaw all down to the south. And it would appear to me that this was one big culture that probably, Cahokia was like the epicenter, the capital of the nation. And they tried to stick together as long as they could, but due to scarcity of resources, then they probably broke up into smaller tribes. They say that the fall of Cahokia was around 1300 AD, and that is a very significant date when you compare it to European history. This was the time of the Black Death and all of the earthquakes and volcanoes, which I'll read an example of in a minute. But Cahokia, the capital of this nation, was estimated to be around 20,000 people. Now, in the 12th and 13th century, this was equal to or greater than the population of London. So on one side of the world, you got the Westerners, and on the other side, you've got the Native Americans, and they were about equal in number. But Cahokia is just one city out of this big nation. Poverty Point, Louisiana is another example of a large city. But like I said, these guys stretched all the way across, up and down modern day United States. Unfortunately, we have this Hollywoodized vision of what Native American life was like in America before Westerners showed up, of, running around in teepees and on horseback. And yes, there were tribes that did that, but there were also agricultural, stable cities, just like our modern Western way of life. You had the city center, and then surrounding it was your farmlands. And so their way of life was nothing like the hunter-gatherer idea that was put in our heads in school. What happened to them? Well, it depends on who you ask. According to one article by NPR, scientists cannot seem to agree on what exactly led to the rise or the fall of this Mississippian American Indian culture. According to a different NPR article, around 1200 AD, weather patterns across North America shifted, and the transcontinental jet stream that once pulled life-giving rains from the Gulf of Mexico began funneling cold air from the bone-dry Arctic, much like what we are seeing right now with the Arctic shifts, I can't remember what they call it, that are coming down and causing all of the late season cold weather that we've had this year. And so they say that we switched from a profound drought at AD 1350. It was the start of the Little Ice Age. The dry spell wouldn't break up for more than 500 years. 500 years. But then in an article from Illinois Times, it says an academic study published this month reveals that the city now called Cahokia Mounds may have been abandoned because of increased flooding of the Mississippi River. So these are all mainstream academic researchers that are going from one extreme to the other. You got one guy over here saying drought, the other guy over here saying flood, drought, flood, and then the guy in the middle saying we don't know. Which, yeah, it sounds like you guys don't know. Now, keeping all of that in mind, that they really don't know what happened to this culture, let's see what Wiki has to say, because they make it sound like they know everything about it. They say that it was a maize-based agriculture. In most places, the development of Mississippian culture coincided with the adoption of comparatively large-scale intensive maize agriculture. Now that, I can see that being proven through pollen samples in the soils. They say shell-tempered pottery, the adoption and use of shells as a tempering agent in ceramics. Now, widespread trade networks extending as far west as the Rocky Mountains, north to the Great Lakes, south to the Gulf of Mexico, and east to the Atlantic Ocean. So they had a trade network that basically extended the whole entirety east of the Rockies. Now, yes, I can see this being proven because just like they pointed out before that with the shell-tempered pottery, if you're finding the same artifacts in all of these different areas, then that definitely indicates that they had a trade network, and this has been documented multiple times in my research. Now, those are all findings that I can get behind. I can see how that you can prove that through the archaeological remains that you're finding all over the country, but then they lose me right here. The development of a chiefdom or complex chiefdom level of social complexity, the development of institutionalized social inequality, a centralization of control of combined political and religious power in the hands of a few or one, the beginnings of a settlement hierarchy in which one major center has clear influence or control over a number of lesser communities which may or may not possess a smaller number of mounds. Now, keeping in mind that they can't even agree on what happened to this culture, how do they come up with that? Now, I guess you could say it's because you have one large centralized mound and then medium-sized mounds around it and then smaller mounds around that. But I am going to point out the fact that just like the Egyptians, just like the Incas, they laid out their cities according to the constellations of their cosmology. At some point, I'll do the video on how the Inca, their constellations were in the Milky Way. They were the dark spots in the Milky Way, but their cities up in the mountains even were laid out as above, so below. Now, before we get into the climate shift part of things, I want to remind everybody of what happened during the Dalton minimum, which was supposed to be a weaker grand solar minimum than the Maunder minimum, which was supposed to be weaker than the Wolf minimum. The big one was the Wolf minimum, the 1300s. That was when the full reset happened, according to the research that I've done. I mean, there's cathedrals that stood for 50 years because nobody survived that still knew how to finish out the cathedral. Now, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the magnitude of the December 16th, 1811 events ranged from 6.7 to 8.1, whereas the ranges for the quakes of January 23rd and February 7th, 1812 were 6.8 to 7.8 and 7.0 to 8.8 respectively. Now, I've read in the past that some of these quakes rang church bells up in Boston and were felt all the way down at the southern tip of Chile. So these are some of the most powerful quakes in our modern history that came from this area, if not the most powerful. And they say that 1,874 quakes were felt as far away as Louisville, Kentucky, which was 190 miles away. And keep in mind, the whole time, Tecumseh's Comet is going across the sky. To put this in a modern day perspective, that earthquake swarm that we had out at Ridgecrest last year, San Diego and Los Angeles are both within right about 190 miles. So over the course of months, that would be like having almost 2,000 quakes that you can actually feel, strong enough to be felt from that far away. So it was a pretty intense ordeal. This area of the country was not heavily populated yet by that time, so they continue on that despite the strength of the tremors, only minor damage to human-made structures was reported from collapsing chimneys, falling trees, and cracking timbers and houses. Some areas sank while others uplifted. Fissures opened up in the ground. Some were filled with water from the nearby Mississippi River or wetlands, which was later expelled high into the air when the fissure closed. So it opened up and then closed and sprayed water all over up in the air. Soil liquefaction caused large sand blows that fouled farmland in Missouri, Tennessee, and Arkansas. On the Mississippi River itself, the shaking calved the soil along the riverbanks and caused trees lining the river to fall into the water. Large waves formed on the water that capsized numerous boats and thrust others onto the land. About 2 lifetimes ago, over Memorial Day weekend, I actually rode my mountain bike from Memphis, Tennessee up to Fort Pillow State Park and camped out for the weekend. And I met a historian out on the trail, and it was really cool because it's Fort Pillow. It's a, Civil War battlefield. This guy walked me through the whole park and laid out the battle step by step, how it went down. And it was really an amazing experience. A very, very cool, very knowledgeable guy. But when we got over to the Mississippi River, he pointed out an area of the bluff line, and he said 3 to 4 miles of the bluff line there fell off into the Mississippi during these earthquakes and caused the Mississippi to actually flow backwards. Now, also during this time period, the area between Tennessee and Kentucky sank and created Reelfoot Lake. So now we have this huge lake that I think at its deepest is only like 8 feet. All the trees are still growing up out of the water. So in this area, we have on record very distinct instances of great cataclysms happening. And we have very detailed accounts from Reverend W.B. Clark all the way up until 1935 over in the UK. He very diligently recorded all of the climactic shifts, all of the meteoric phenomena. There was a lot going on. But let's drop back to the 1300s, the time of the fall of Cahokia. And since we don't have written records here in America, we'll do a comparative history of what was going on over in China and what was happening in Europe. Because just like in the 1800s, we've got records of it happening in America and over in the UK. Very clear records showing that these were worldwide events. These weren't isolated to certain areas. Before the man-made climate change agenda was instituted in 1888, JFC Hecker wrote the following. These great events began in the year 1333, 15 years before the plague broke out in Europe. They first appeared in China. Here, a parching drought accompanied by famine commenced in the tract of country watered by the rivers Kiang and Hao. This was followed by such violent torrents of rain in and about King Sai, at that time the capital of the empire, that according to tradition, more than 400,000 people perished in the floods. Finally, the mountain Xinjiao fell in, and vast clefts were formed in the earth. In the succeeding year, 1334, the neighborhood of Canton was visited by inundations, whilst in Xi, after an unexampled drought, a plague arose, which is said to have carried off about 5 million people. A few months afterwards, an earthquake followed at and near Qinghai, and subsequent to the falling in of the mountains of Qimingcheng, a lake was formed of more than 100 leagues in circumference, where again thousands found their grave. Now, a league is 3.4 miles, so that's a 340-mile lake that formed over in China during the 1300s, just like I was talking about Reelfoot Lake in America during the 1800s, sinking down and forming. Simultaneously with a drought and renewed floods in China in 1336, many uncommon atmospheric phenomena, and in the winter, frequent thunderstorms were observed in the north of France. And so early as the eventful year of 1333, an eruption of Etna took place. According to the Chinese annuals, about 4 million of the people perished by famine during this round of things in Kiang, and deluges, swarms of locusts, and an earthquake which lasted 6 days caused incredible devastation. So like I said, I don't think Mudflood was one event that got erased out of our history books. I think it was a series of events that all happened over a short period of time. I've even done a video showing the different layers of the different floods in the Yellow River Valley over in China. But I do think that this information has been deliberately left out of our history books so they can promote their man-made climate change agenda, and they just oversimplify everything and say, oh, it was the Black Death and it came over on fleas from mice. Must have been some big-ass fleas jumping around causing a bunch of earthquakes. Now, I still think there's a problem with the dating. I can't believe that historians don't even want to catch on to this, evidently, because it would just make perfect sense that if you have all of this going on in China, then you would equate it to the same events over in Europe. But no, according to mainstream in Europe, it wasn't until 1348 that on the island of Cyprus, the plague from the east had already broken out. 15 years later, it took 15 years for the plague and the earthquakes and everything to reach from China to the Mediterranean. That makes perfect sense, right? Anyway, when an earthquake shook the foundations on the island and was accompanied by so frightful a hurricane that the inhabitants who had slain their Mahometan slaves in order that they might not themselves be subjugated by them, fled in dismay in all directions. The sea overflowed, the ships were dashed to pieces on the rocks, and few outlived the terrific event. So almost everybody died there on the island, whereby this fertile and blooming island was converted into a desert. Before the quake, a pestiferous wind spread so poisonous an odor that many, being overpowered by it, fell down suddenly and expired in dreadful agonies. Now, I have many accounts of the plague being preceded by a foul and bitter odor in the air. I still theorize that when these chasms open up in the ground, either noxious fumes are escaping, like maybe a heavy sulfur or something like that, or possibly even bacteria or something that lives down in caverns in the earth are released, which I would probably lean harder on that side of things, because you have accounts of boils and, all this nasty stuff going on, and the fact that it's contagious. So I lean much heavier towards some kind of bacteria or something like that being released from underground than the noxious, odors from the ground, because if it was like sulfates or something like that, it would not be contagious. And in Reverend Clark's 1833 writings, he even says something similar to that. He suggests that volcanic eruptions are causing some of the diseases of the time. And I believe he actually says something about chasms in the ground opening up being a cause of some of the disease. Now, to touch on the Inca real quick, and another problem I have with official dating is you have cataclysms in Europe recorded approximately 500 AD and 1300 AD, and then exactly 100 years apart from that, over in South America, you have cataclysms in 600 AD and 1400 AD. Now, the Inca maintained that a world age is 20 great conjunctions. A great conjunction is every 20 years, so that's approximately 800 years is the entirety of a world age, according to their histories. These are the events that mainstream academia puts at 14 to 1450 AD, which I still think was the same events, same worldwide events, all happened at the same time. China, Europe, North America, South America. It just makes sense that it was all at the same time. The Inca say that in those days there was a great famine which lasted for 7 years. During that time, the seed produced no fruit, many died of hunger, and it's even said that some ate their own children. In that time, there existed great loss of life among the Indians from hunger, thirst, and pestilence, because as punishment, God withheld the rain for 7 years, some say for 10. There were cataclysms, earthquakes, and many storms, it now being the occupation of all to weep and bury the dead. The Inca referred to this as the death of a son, or a Pachacuti, and namely the moment of destruction of one age or son and the commencement of the next. To the Inca, this was the commencement of the fifth sun, or the fifth world age. Now, guys, they were afraid that Cusco was going to get flooded by Lake Titicaca. And if you look here on the maps, you can see how far Lake Titicaca is from Cusco. And keep in mind, this is high up in the mountains down there, high up in the Andes. So I'll check and see if I can find the actual elevations, but I'm assuming that the elevation of Cusco is much higher than Lake Titicaca, but you can see the distance of how far away it is. And so we are talking major floods. I think the Incas reported like 30 days of non-stop rain. I think this is the important takeaway from all of this. They say that in that time there was a great flood, and they believed it was the end of the world, but that they would first suffer a very great drought. The sun and the moon, which they worship, would be lost, and for a reason were the Indians accustomed to cry and give out great shouts and lamentations when there was an eclipse, especially of the sun. So first they had a drought and famine that lasted 7 to 10 years, according to their accounts, and it was followed directly by inundations and great flooding. Now, getting back to North America, keep in mind that the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi River is only about 10 miles north of Cahokia Mountains. With all of our modern technology, electric well pumps, and irrigation systems and everything, we're not near as affected by drought as they would have been back in this time. But looking at our modern era here, the first decade of the century, from 2000 to 2010, the upper Missouri River Basin was the driest it's been in 1,200 years, even more parched than during the disastrous Dust Bowl of the 1930s, a new study says. The drop in water level at the mouth of the Missouri was due to rising temperatures linked to climate change that reduced the amount of snowfall in the Rocky Mountains in Montana and North Dakota. Climate change, yes. Man-made, no. These are just cycles that we go through. Now, they refer to this as the turn of the century drought. And in terms of the most severe flow deficits, the driest years of the turn of the century drought in the upper Missouri River Basin appear unmatched over the last 1,200 years, the study said. Only a single event in the late 13th century rivaled the greatest deficits of this most recent event. So this study is confirming drought during the 1300s. So when I look back at the scientists that are arguing, drought, rain, guys, you're both right. When you do the comparative histories of all around the world, it shows very clearly that during these climactic shifts, you have a drought directly followed by flooding. And that's exactly what we have seen in the past 20 years here with, concerning the Missouri River. It went through a severe drought, and then, 2000 to 2010. And then they say that during the years 2012, 2013, and 2017, there were bad droughts. And then if you've watched this channel for any period of time, you know that last year was the start of the severe flooding. And we're getting into flood season again. I know Chicago's very flooded right now, and many areas of the river are above flood stage right now. So to answer the question of what happened to Cahokia and what started the demise of the Mississippian culture, in my opinion, all of the above. I'd say that they went through a huge drought, just like everywhere else in the world. You had famine, which with the lack of nutrition, you're going to be more susceptible to disease. They're also right next to a known fault line, so that could have been popping off just as well. And then I would say that a great big flood was the final blow that took them out. Now, the way I look at it, they're in a floodplain there. That's the reason for the mound building, because they accounted for the usual spring flooding, your normal average every year spring flooding. I lived in Memphis for a number of years, and in the springtime, the flooding, the Mississippi will rise up and it will flood 30 miles over into Arkansas. So the mound building side of things makes perfect sense. And from an agricultural standpoint, the flooding comes in, brings in new nutrient-rich soil, deposits it all over the ground. And then when the floodwaters start going down, then you got real easy planting. So with the easy production of food, and an abundance of it, then you have time to build cities. You have time for religious practices, for arts, for crafts, for dance, for everything. This is without an easy surplus of food, people are only worried about survival. So this is the key to building civilizations. Before we get into the map anomalies, I wanted to show you this. This is known as a meander map. Now, this is showing how many times the Mississippi River has changed course at Cape Girardeau, Missouri, just since the 1800s, since they've been keeping track of this, since Western settlers have been there. All of those course changes are due to normal yearly spring flooding and are not accounting for grand solar minimum cataclysmic flooding and inundations. You can see how year after year the river just whips around like a snake. They've been trying ever since Western settlers got here to keep this river and the Missouri River under control, but they just can't do it. It's Mother Nature is much more powerful than man's engineering. So if you had an event such as a Great Lake busting loose, which by the way right now they are at historic highs, then you could have cataclysmic flooding that would literally change the course of the river in a major way. First, let's look at a modern map of the watershed, and you can clearly see that all rivers flow into the centralized Mississippi River, and then the Mississippi River flows down to New Orleans and out into the Gulf of Mexico. But apparently that wasn't always the case. According to cartographers from the 1600s, it looked like this. This map and other maps show two main rivers going up what is now the Mississippi Valley, where you just have the one Mississippi River going down through there. I will never forget this comment that a girl left last year talking about her dad down in Arkansas. He was down there and when he was a kid, and this old timer came up to him and said, "Mister, they ain't never going to tell you this, but you're still in Texas. These mountains got pushed up here in that big earthquake." See, things like that really stick with me. I mean, this guy is obviously talking about the 1811, 1812 New Madrid earthquakes. And I mean, guys, there's missing islands. There's lakes that are missing. You know, here they're showing a mountain range to the left of where it says Kofa. And that's really not like that anymore. You have that pushed up and to the right, and that's the Ozark Mountains. And, you know, the Ozark Mountains are just huge rocks covered over with mud, basically. And, you know, all throughout everywhere, there's all kinds of stone-sized rocks, all the way up to, you know, big 4-footers and plateaus and everything. And it's really a unique place. You know, it's much different than the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas and, you know, even the Appalachians. But in the springtime, it's really beautiful. It's, you know, almost rainforest type conditions. Waterfalls everywhere, springs everywhere, and it's beautiful for a couple weeks out of the year. Also, on these maps from the 1600s, they show a huge lake in, I'm placing it just south of Asheville, North Carolina, in what kind of looks like a basin here. Now, this may have just been, you know, a 3-foot deep swamp type area. It may have been something as simple as just, you know, just plain old climate change and the thing dried up. But when you have a lake this big, I don't care if it is a swampy area, you're going to have civilizations around the edge of it. I mean, that's just the way it is. Water is a necessity for life. I guess if it's too swampy, you might not want to be drinking out of it. But hey, people lived on the swamp down in Louisiana, didn't they? So I can really only speculate on what has and has not happened. But, you know, these maps very clearly show different waterways than what we have now. And I don't think two separate cartographers would be showing two rivers going up through there unless there was two rivers. So I was going to end this video reading from a book from 1671, but for some reason National Archives is not pulling it up to a resolution where I can actually read it. So I'll just go ahead and wrap everything up. You know, it looks to me like Cahokia itself, that city, I'd say the researchers are all correct. You know, just like what happened down in Peru, where we have very clear accounts, and Europe and China, you have a period of drought followed by flooding. Now, when I compare that to modern times, we had the turn of the century drought up in the plains, and then it was also a very bad drought out in California for many, many years. And then we just got followed up. Last year was very heavy rains over the winter in California and all of the US, and it seems like everywhere in the world that I was checking. And, who knows? You know, parts of that may have been, probably were due to geoengineering, but I've said it before, I'll say it again. If it was me and I had this technology and I had this knowledge that these cycles were coming around, yeah, if I've already waited 200 years for world domination, then, go ahead and wait the extra 20 years until Mother Nature's working with you, and then go wreak your havoc. But something I've definitely been considering is, what if everything we've seen so far is just kind of a precursor cycle? Because, everything does go in cycles. I mean, agriculture and farmers have actually, the Farmer's Almanac figures in the 11-year normal sun cycles. So this raining and flooding that we're having right now could be a precursor cycle. We could go into 7 years of drought, just like the Incas documented, and then really get hit hard next cycle around 2030 or so, 2032. I don't know. But I'll tell you that the average people that I talk to, that don't watch YouTube videos and keep up with any of this stuff, they notice that the weather is changing. I've got a lot of people that are saying, yeah, the seasons are off right now because everything seems shut back a month or so. And I even ran into a campground manager the other day, just a 70-year-old good old country boy. And I didn't bring it up. He brought it up. He was talking about whether or not he was going to open up his campground due to the bug. And then he finally said, I don't know how much I believe the news about everything they're saying about the bug. So I am glad to see that, your average CNN and MSNBC and Fox News watcher out there is starting to question things. That's a good sign. I'm really hoping that they overplayed their hand on this and they wake up a sleeping giant. A guy can dream, right? Hope you guys enjoyed the vid. Love you guys. Take care of yourselves out there. Static out.